In order to have a good church broadcast, you need to have good audio. A lot of people even think it's more important than the quality of your video. Even if you have the cleanest looking live stream, if the audio is bad, people are going to click off because what's the point of watching? You can't hear it. But if you've got great audio, people don't mind a subpar video because at least they can treat it kind of like a podcast and listen to it. However, if you've watched many church live streams, you'd know that good audio is hard to find. And setting it up for your broadcast can actually seem pretty daunting if you haven't done it before. Things sound differently coming through speakers or headphones versus in a live room, so just taking your normal room mix and pumping it online usually isn't a great option. In an ideal world, you'd build a whole separate mix for your stream. Every input would be set up and EQ'd perfectly for online and things would sound amazing. The problem is, setting up something like that requires more gear, more people, and most importantly, more expertise. It's a completely different way of mixing compared to in the room, and honestly, most of us struggle enough just doing that. So what on earth is a church supposed to do in order to get a great sounding live stream on a budget? Well, I'll tell you what. You set up a post-fader bus mix. Think about the musicians on your stage. They're using in-ear or stage monitors to listen to what they're doing, but that's not usually the main mix. They each have their own separate bus mix that they're listening to in order to make sure that they can hear what's important to them. This is the same idea, but for your live stream instead of for your musicians. The other key part is that a monitor mix is usually pre-fader. That is, the individual levels aren't affected by what the front of house engineer is actually doing. However, you want your live stream mix to be post-fader so that you can take advantage of the mixing that your engineer is already doing, and so you don't need a separate person actively running things. All the changes that your front of house makes to the levels will pass along to you, but all relative to the positions you've set your faders at. I'm not going to go super deep into all the nuances of pre-fader versus post-fader here. There's enough of that for multiple more videos. But just trust me on this for now, you want this to be post-fader. We utilize this method at my church, and we've been pretty happy with the results of our audio. Take a quick listen, and then I'll walk through what our mix actually looks like and all the little nuances to it. Look, our mix definitely isn't perfect, and some weeks are better than others, but we're pretty happy with where it's at. Let's dig into how we actually built it out. First of all, the hardware. So if you've watched any of my videos, you know we meet in a theater, so we only have access to the soundboard, a Yamaha CL5, on Sunday mornings. All of our different inputs come in here where our front of house engineer mixes for the room. We've created a stereo matrix on the board, which is similar to a mix, but a little different, but for the purposes of this video, just doesn't really matter very much. And we've mapped it to a couple of outputs on our console. The big thing to note here is that it is a stereo mix. We used to run a mono mix, and I cannot stress enough how much of a difference this has made for us. In fact, take a quick listen to the difference, and you'll kind of see what I mean.
One could ever comprehend. Your word will be enough. Your promise we will trust. Greater things are still ahead. You're not done yet.
Like I said, if you can, stereo mix all the way. Anyway, we run a couple of XLRs into this small analog mixer that sits with our live stream equipment, and then we run 2 1/4-inch cables straight into our ATEM constellation. The reason we do that is so that our live stream director can monitor the audio coming into the ATEM, since it doesn't have a great way to do that built into it. It also gives us a bit more level control at our hands rather than deep in the ATEM settings. Our live stream director is also responsible for making any changes to our broadcast mix by using Yamaha's Stage Mix app. It allows us to control most of what we could do from the console, but on an iPad. That way our front of house engineer doesn't even have to think about the live stream mix. These days, we don't actually have to make that many tweaks as we go because we've gotten the levels in a pretty good place for week to week. We mostly set things during rehearsal depending on the particular band we have that day. Then we'll listen back right after rehearsal ends and make any extra tweaks that we need, and then we basically don't touch it again during service. And part of the reason for that is that it's really hard to hear the mix when the room is really loud and the band is playing. Ideally, we'd be in a separate place, but these are the constraints we have to work in. So that's the equipment and the process, but let's take a look at the actual mix that I've built for our live stream. It works for us, and definitely feel free to take the general ideas from this, but don't think that you'll be able to copy it one for one. It's going to take some experimentation to figure out what works best for you. Okay, that's enough disclaimers, let's take a look at it. So let's start off looking at our vocals, specifically Vox 2 and 3 and HW 1 and 2, that stands for hardwired. So if we look at that, you can see they're mostly level across the board, except for hardwired 2. We have that one pulled down a little bit because it's right in front of the drum kit, and honestly, we just get quite a bit of noise from it. That doesn't sound great on stream. So we pull that one down a little bit. But if you look at the others, they're pretty level with each other. This is because our front of house engineer is actually mixing those vocals as the morning goes on. And so as different people lead different songs, we don't need to make that adjustment for our live stream because we're getting it for free from the front of house. Next up is our speaker mic, and that'll be our pastor's headset. You can see that that's bumped all the way up. And that's because realistically we find that it's just too quiet if we don't do this. It could be gained up more, but that would affect the front of house mix as well. So we basically just need to pump this all the way up, and we found that it's pretty good there. Then we've got a couple ancillary channels, in-house music, which we don't use on the live stream, and then video for if we happen to play any videos in the room. You'll notice that that one's actually marked as pre, which means it's pre-fader as opposed to all these other ones that are post-fader. And realistically, this is just because I want full control over this, and because our videos don't really need any EQ for the live stream, I mean, they're videos, they've already been pretty well EQ'd, I don't feel like I gain anything by keeping this one post-fader. And because we're not going to be playing videos in a time where we have to mute and unmute them, I feel pretty safe doing this. The last thing to notice on this page is all the panning up at the top. You notice all of these are panned directly center. If you've got a stereo mix, make sure your vocals are panned to the center, otherwise you're gonna have a rough time. You could potentially pan your backup vocals off to the sides, but if you're not keeping track of who's leading and who's not at any given time, this could get really tricky, and I find it's just not that worth it. Let's move on to the next page. Over here, we have our keys, left and right, and our 2 electric guitars, and our acoustic guitar. Again, you can see most of them are pretty close to unity, which means we're getting the levels pretty directly from the front of house board. You do notice that some of them are a little above and a little below, and this kind of depends on who's actually running front of house and how hot they might particularly like the guitars or the keys in those songs, or who's playing those or what parts they're playing. So we'll tweak these a little bit week to week, but again, they stay pretty close to unity because our front of house engineers are doing their jobs really well. The really big thing to notice here is the panning. This is where a stereo mix really becomes great because you can create separation in your audio to be able to hear all of these different instruments. I'm not going to dig super deep into panning and all the nuances of it, but just taking a look here, you can see we've got the keys panned all the way out left and right, as well as one of our guitars. Our second guitar we have panned in a little closer, and then our acoustic guitar, which is actually in mono, we just have a little bit off to the right. I think actually after I took these screenshots, I adjusted where those electric guitars are because I didn't really want them sitting right on top of the keys like that. But these are things that we can play with depending on what guitars are playing what parts in the songs, and really gives us some space to fill up the entire soundstage. This is one of the things that you'll want to spend some time really tweaking week to week as you get your different instruments in there. It makes a huge difference to how your overall live stream mix sounds. Alright, and up next we've got this page which has a few kind of random things on it, but the one I really want to look at are the tracks and the bass. So our tracks is actually just a single channel from our iPad that's running multi-tracks. In an ideal world, we'd have individual channels for each one of those, but we just have a single one. I have this panned off a little bit to the side and pulled down a little bit because I feel like they kind of overtake the mix when they're online. Next up, we have our click and our drum talkback mic. Now, we obviously don't want either of those things in our live stream mix, so we have those pulled down and muted just in case. One time I accidentally had the drum talkback mic in, but luckily we figured that out pretty quick. Next channel is the bass. Again, you'll notice this is pre-fader. This is because personally, I feel like you lose a lot of body from the bass if you actually have it EQ'd the way that it is in the room. Once it goes online, you're losing a lot of that low end, and so I want to make sure we're not cutting any of that out ahead of time. So I keep that pre-fader in order to cut out any of that EQ that we're getting. Again, pretty close to unity, just like you'd expect. The next channel we're not using today, but it's our synth bass. Tiny little keyboard, looks pretty cute, sounds really cool. I can't really speak to that level because we haven't used it in a minute, but again, we'll adjust that wherever we need to. And then finally, we have a couple of choir mics and also a crowd mic. We keep the crowd mic mixed pretty low. I don't personally feel like our positioning for it is that great. Again, because we're setting up and tearing down every week, we just can't really set it in a place that I'd really love it. So we try to turn it up in really quiet moments where we get a lot of ambient noise, but for the most part, it doesn't do a whole lot. Again, notice that we've got that bass center panned. You don't really want to pan that out to the side. You want to keep it in the center and make sure those low end levels are driving that song and all that energy. And finally, we have all of our drum channels here. Something that should stick out pretty instantly is that most of them are marked as pre-fader. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, I feel like sometimes the room EQ cuts out a little bit of the low end, and I really want that, similar to what I was talking about with the bass guitar. But the big thing is that you get a lot of acoustic sound from the drums in the room, and so you might have those levels down pretty low on your actual mix. The problem is, if I'm in a post-fader mix, I may not actually have enough signal to make sure it's loud enough to match all my other channels. So I've made the decision to mark those as pre-fader to make sure that I have enough headroom to actually get them sounding loud enough in our mix. I would love to be able to EQ these very specifically for our mix, but because I can't do that, I've found that this is the best way to go. You'll also notice that the levels vary pretty widely here compared to maybe some of the other channels we've looked at, and that's because they're pre-fader, and so we're not getting the benefit of getting mixed from the front of house console. Now, if you look over at the hi-hat and the overhead mics, you'll notice those are actually muted. And this feels really silly, but I found that we actually get enough ambient noise from some of our microphones from our vocalists that turning on those mics actually just overwhelms you with cymbal noise. I know this is probably not great, but again, it's just a thing that I've found in our space that works the best for us. So these are the types of things that you really need to just experiment with and figure out what works for your live stream mix. Finally, we've got the drum pad, and that's an entirely digital like beat pad. And so you'll notice it's actually pulled down a bit. And again, because that's a purely digital signal that's being sent into the board, he might actually have that pulled pretty high up in order to get it to cut through some of the acoustic noises in the room. But we don't need that much of it in the live stream, especially because it's usually used in more down moments. So I've got that pulled back quite a bit. The other thing to notice on this page is, again, the panning. You want to make sure your kick and your snare are right on the center, but then outside of that, you can kind of build the panning to taste. And so I actually have the toms arranged how they are on the stage, kind of left to right. This gives a great feel as he makes a progression through the toms. You can actually feel it moving right to left in your ears, and it sounds real nice. On this page here, we have maybe the most important part of our vocals, and that is the reverb. This depends a lot on the actual reverb effects that you're using on your mixer, but the big thing for us is that second channel, verb return, we have that cranked pretty high. And because without a decent amount of reverb in your live stream mix, those vocals are just going to sound really hollow, really empty, and they're just not going to fill any space. If you were actually building a full mix on a DAW or a separate mixer, you could add a lot of different effects to really help fill out those vocals. But in a post-fader mix world, really just crank that verb. The way that I found works the best for me is I push it up right up until I think, that sounds like a lot, and then I pull it back just a tiny bit. And that's usually what sounds about the best for us. All right, so we've got a couple small settings I want to look at too. First is compression. I have a pretty basic compressor thrown on here. You'll have to play with this just to figure out what works best for you. Yeah, not a lot to say there. It's compression. And finally, just an overall mix EQ. Now this graph might look crazy, and honestly, I could probably tweak it more than I have, but again, I get kind of scared making big changes because I'm pretty happy with the way things sound. The big things to note here are that big spike in the low end and the couple of small peaks up in the high end. But we've got that big spike because I feel like if you don't have a decent amount of bass coming through on your live stream, it just sounds weak and thin. So I've found that boosting that up really just helps to fill out the live stream mix. And then over there on the high end, just adds a little bit of sparkle to the voices just to make sure they sound nice and pretty online. Look, I'm not an audio engineer and I can't really talk you through the real specifics and the science and the best ways to do all of this. I just know what's worked for us and it's worked through a lot of experimentation. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, and honestly, we're still making small adjustments week to week as we have different ideas and different thoughts that we want to try based on how things are sounding. But overall, we feel pretty good about how things have been lately. Your church live stream doesn't have to sound like an album, but it can sound good regardless of the gear that you're using. Just put some real work into it, and over time, it'll get better. I hope this helps you improve your live stream mix. Until next time.